Hello and welcome to this breakdown of my new Geo FastHair procedural hair generator. I built this because I am working on a project where I have 50 plus characters, and I was thinking there's no way I'm going to be manually sculpting individual hairs for 50 characters. I want a GeoNode setup that does that for me, and very importantly, has a seed option where I can just generate new hairstyles with the click of a button. So how does this work? Basically, it is a GeoNode setup with a bunch of sliders that let you control hair that spawns procedurally off of a scalp object. So let's start with getting it into a scene. Chances are you've got this. You've got a character ready with no hair. Here's my character. I want to put hair in it. So I'm going to append in one of the objects that is in the Geo FastHair blend file. So if we look in objects, I have a bunch of sample hairs that are a good basis to use for whatever kind of hair you want, for whatever kind of hairstyle. I'm going to start with generic. And when I append that in, all right, here's my generic hair. I'm going to move it up into position. Now, this matches already pretty closely because this was my base character that I was working on, but chances are it's not going to match your character because the head shape is going to be different. So if we click here and we go into our GeoNode setup, I have this enable conform object option, and this lets you click and select your character, and the GeoNode setup will automatically conform to the shape of your character's head, assuming your character is generally human shaped. Now, how is this working? If we look under the hood, I have a source mesh in here. The hair strands are actually spawning off of this mesh. So what you want to do is align this mesh as close as you can to your actual character, and then re-enable the conform object. And if you really need to, you could go into edit mode on the mesh, and you could adjust various parts of this emitter mesh just to line it up as well as you can. And then conform should take care of the rest. Also, while we're looking at the preview object, I have a subdivision option, which gives you more or less fidelity on the actual hairline, which is less important on this kind of hair, which hides most of the hairline. But if you have hair that's very short, you're going to notice if the subdivision is low. All right, I'm going to hide the source mesh. So now it's just the hair on the character. And let's look at some of these settings. All right, very importantly up here, I have this simplify feature. So what this does is it simplifies the number of strands and the size of them to compensate so that if you have a slower graphics card, you can make changes more quickly. And if I lower this value, you can see we get more and more hair, thinner and thinner, finer hair, all the way to the most complex hair. So if I zoom way in, you can see we have very fine hair. But changing any of these settings is going to be very slow because it is trying so hard to do all these calculations. And so having this viewport simplification is very useful for adjusting all these sliders. There's also a simplify for the render, which only goes into effect at render time, but same deal where if you're rendering from a distance, you don't need that perfect fine hair, so you can turn this value up a bit. There's also a strand resolution setting, which adjusts how many samples go into each individual hair. If I turn on the wireframe and we look up close, the higher I make this number, the more individual samples run along each strand. Great for long hair, but it will also slow down the processing time. Also in the global settings is the global seed, which changes a lot of the wave texture, a lot of the spawn locations, just to give you unique options for each one. Another way to make things run a little faster, if things are slow for you, is to make a copy of your character and in edit mode, delete everything below the line you know will be the hair. And now I will tell the GeoNode setup to use that new object instead of the full body. All right, for the rest of the settings, I'm going to switch over to the Geo FastHair blend file because in this file, like I mentioned, are a bunch of sample base hair meshes that you can use as a starting point. So let's look at a long-haired one. Here's a long hair sample. And so the next option in the emitter settings is the fix intersections option. And this does a decent job, not a perfect job, but a decent job of moving hair out from inside the body. And you can actually use a slider to control how far away that hair moves from the body. Hopefully you don't have to turn it very high up though. All right, let's look at the spawn settings. So the first is the hairline, and to look at the hairline, let's look at a hairstyle that's very thin, like a crew cut here. So what this slider does is control how much of the scalp gets hair. So a young person probably has a very low hairline, and an older person can have a receding hairline. What's controlling this is a vertex group, this hairline vertex group. So if we look at the source mesh and we go into weight paint, here is the hairline vertex group that is controlling where the hair can go. And if you want, you can adjust it, like we could smudge some hairline over farther if we want. And this is also where that subdivision comes in handy, because if I turn down the subdivision all the way, you can see that the hairline is based on the individual polygons of the source mesh. So turning up the subdivision rounds out that shape. All right, next in the spawn settings is the hair density. Let's look at a different model for that. And this controls how many hairs are spawned. There's a second density option, which is the extra hair. And what this does is spawn hair specifically on areas that tend to look too sparse. Areas like where the crown is on the head and along the part itself, and sometimes along the hairline itself. So that's an option in case the original density just doesn't look thick enough in those areas. You also have the max hair density. So if we turn this way down, if you have a lower end processor, you can save yourself from a crash, because if you have too many hairs, you could crash your machine. Next up is hair clusters. And again, this could crash the machine. So I am going to turn the density down and hit enable. And what this does, if we turn up the probability, is instead of individual strands being spawned, it'll spawn multiples per strand. And here, amount controls how many extra strands each emitted strand gets. And the separation controls how far apart they start, and clumping, how far apart they end. And so this can make a nice, sharp, pointy hair effect. But do be warned that this amount does multiply the initial density, so it can be very processor heavy. Next up, we have hair lengths. And hair lengths do about what you'd expect. The global length affects all the hairs growing out of the head. But you also have the ability to choose specific parts of the head and how long each individual area gets. There's also a randomize option, which will randomize the length of each individual strand. All right, next up is the hair shape settings, probably the most useful menu in here. This controls the overall shape of all the hairs. And the first one, of course, is gravity, which will raise and lower the hairs. Do note that it will change the length of the hairs too, because it is only affecting the Z direction of existing strands. So expect some hair length to change as you adjust it. Crown position is the apex of the hair and where that occurs along the head. And then top direction controls whether or not the top of the head is slicked towards the back or if it's moved to the front. So sides upper direction controls the direction of the hair right below the top half of the head. So does sides lower direction. What this does especially is pull the hair behind the ears, which can be a very useful thing for longer hair. Backside direction moves the hair towards and away from the back of the head. Conform to head will move the hair towards and away from the head itself in all directions. And beyond conform to head, we have individual controllers for how much to flatten. So flatten sides, flatten the front, flatten the back. Puff roots will move all the hair away from the head. And this is also useful if you're getting intersections, so you can see up at the top. Now lift long hair, we got to look at a long hair option. So this will take the hair that's around the shoulders and move it up and away. And the type of lifting it does can be controlled by this slider. You can see that the very tips curl outward away from the head, whereas if you set this to 1, the hair just above the tips curls out and away from the head. And then relax hair, really only useful on long hairstyles like this. If you're getting some crazy waves that are just too much, relax hair will fix that. But I find that usually with the correct settings, everything looks okay without it. All right, next up is the part settings. So part amount obviously would control how much the hair gets parted, and it can go way back along the head. And the further back it goes, the more likely the hair is to go under the head. Now, fixed intersections doesn't work here because fixed intersections is more designed for long hair. So to fix this, We have the puff part option, which you can turn up to try and get the hair back out of the head. You can also use the puff roots to pull all the hair out away from the head. But chances are you won't have to part the hair this much. Part probability means that not all the strands get parted, but usually I have this all the way up to 1. And the part position is the right to left position along the head so that you can move the part from side to side. And then lift part will lift up the part, and it will do so mainly at the front of the head. Note also that where the part ends up can be controlled by the flatten front option. So the less influence you have from this flatten front, the more frontward facing the part will end up being. All right, wave and curl settings. Here is a long hair without any sort of waves and curls. So if I turn up the amount of waves, the hair gets wavy. And we have a choice between sort of chaotic waves and more orderly curls. But this can feel very unnatural, so I recommend a mix of the wave and the curl feature. And then the scale controls the size, so going up makes tighter curls, tighter waves, and going down you can make it much smoother wave. You can also offset the wave and curl, which will move the waves and curls up and down the length of the head. And now we have some randomization features which work together. There's the randomizer, which adjusts the offset of individual strands, and the scale of the randomization sort of creates a mask of different sizes that runs through the hairline, changing where individual strands get their curl height. So the higher the scale size, the more individual patches you get. Kink and frizz creates additional noise in the hair, very useful for making a naturalistic look. And so the higher the probability, the more hairs get selected for this extra curling. So you could have, for instance, a few outlier hairs that are extra frizzy, or you can have all the hairs be a little bit frizzy. And then there's settings for where along the hair strand the frizz happens. But if you frizz the roots, you run the risk of having the hair move off of the scalp, and you probably don't want that. And just like with the wave curl settings, you can offset where the noise pattern of the frizz goes, and you can adjust its scale. You can also add roughness and randomizing. If you turn that off, you can have a frizz that affects whole swaths of the hair uniformly. And the final settings are the sideburns. So the first setting is the sideburn mask. And what this does is control how much of this area next to the ear is considered the sideburns. So if you turn it all the way down, all the hair is considered part of the regular hair scalp and will be controlled by the previous settings. Or you can turn it much higher and say that everything below, say this line, is sideburn. And then you have an option for how much of the face the sideburns can cover. And you can control their length if you want some crazy sideburn effects. You can also flatten them against the head or have them come out farther. You can control the direction they go towards the front or the back of the head, and you can puff them out. But chances are you will just want these at very low values. So this GeoNodes group has covered all the procedural generation settings, but we have this additional GeoNodes group that controls the render settings, that converts the curves created by the GeoNodes settings into a mesh that renders. If I turn this off, this is what the main GeoNodes setting is creating. It's just curves, and so they don't have any thickness, they don't have any materials on them. And so what this one does is add that thickness. So in here we have some various options for the inputs and the outputs. So for instance, this enable hair mesh creates the mesh out of the existing curves. Enable hair curves preserves the hair curves through this modifier as well. If you're just planning to render this object as your hair, then you don't need this. Same with this one, convert geometry to curves. Don't need that for now. Strands to sprites. Now, if we look in the shader editor, we can see up close that each individual hair is just rendering as a solid cylinder. And that's how we're getting our overall hair look. But an alternative to that is to use a shader that has a texture of multiple hairs. For instance, something like this. And this can look pretty good. Here are the individual strands that are getting created, and here's the sprite shader on top. These are cylindrical profiles, but you can change it to a flat profile. And this can also be an effective way of creating low poly but realistic hair. You also have the option to randomize the tilt of the hair. So if you turn that all the way down, all the hair meshes are going to spawn in a specific direction, whereas randomized tilt will have them spawn in every direction. And taper ends does just that. It'll create a sharper or a more open edge to the end of the hair. And then there's various material settings so that if you want, you can replace these with your own materials if you've got them. All right, so this object with these geometry node setups is technically enough to get you to a final render, in my opinion. But what if you want to export this to curves? Well, you can do that. So I'm going to go to my main character file, and I'm going to append again from the Geo FastHair scene, this Geo FastHair convert to curves object. And right now this is an empty curves object, but it has a GeoNode setup on it where you can assign the hair object that you've been working on, and it converts it to curves. You can tell it's curves because the closer in I get, the thinner the curves themselves look. And then what you can do with this is apply the GeoNodes modifier, and now you've got real curves that you can actually go in and tweak and sculpt. Now, one thing to note, you'll remember in our render settings here, there was this enable hair curves switch. What this does is create the curves that this object sees. So if that is disabled, it can't convert curves because there are none on this source mesh. It's been switched to a mesh only. So that is what this setting is for. It is to be used if you're trying to create a curve object. And you can move it to the head, of course, by first selecting it and then selecting the hair in the right place and copying all to selected. And so now we've got two objects. We've got the one that controlled all the hair, and we've got the final curves that we can use for other effects. All right, now let's say you've converted the curve object. So this is nothing but curves, and you do want to go back to the render settings that I have provided. You can do that. You can create a geometry nodes modifier and give it that FastHair renderer Nodegroup. And now it is double transforming the radius, so you can just set this to something crazy like 1,000 and get that hair thickness back. You should be able to use the strands and sprites as well. Or you can convert this to a mesh. Now you might be asking, why would I ever want to convert the hair to a mesh? And the reason has to do with deformations. Sometimes for shaggier hair, you can just parent the hair to your head bone if it's rigged, but in this case, it's not going to work. If my head's turning, that scalp gets deformed. I'm going to object convert mesh. So what I can do is create a surface deform modifier. I can pick the character mesh and I can hit bind. It takes it a second. And now, if I deform the mesh, the hair will deform with it, and it will even stretch on a per vertex basis. And then to get that to render again, because again, there's only edges here, we have to create the geometry nodes, add that renderer, and here is where that third option comes in handy. Because the source is geometry and not a curve, if you check this, you get your curves back. Don't need enable hair curves because there aren't any. And so now I have a renderable piece of hair that will conform to any deformations of the character. Pretty cool. All right, so I think I've covered everything about using this tool. I think it's a very useful and versatile tool, and hopefully it will save you a lot of time in generating hair for characters. Thank you very much.